So today we have a pleasure to host at Strathclyde virtually Professor Andrea Renda from the European University Institute and CPS, who is one of those thinkers who capable to bring some logic, some rationale behind this prima facie very complex policies related to data governance and data protection emerging very quickly in the European Union as well as in other jurisdictions. Andrea, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to a healthy and informative discussion.
Thank you very much, Oles. It's a pleasure. I don't know if I'll be able to reduce the complexity. Let's see. This is typically a task that I take on with pleasure and enthusiasm. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. And I think what I'm about to dive into is, if you wish, an almost unprecedented attempt, which is that of inverting the tide, if you wish, turning the tide of history in cyberspace in a few months, if you wish, which is not, as for the reasons that I will try to explain in the coming minutes, it's not going to be easy, and it's probably going to take a little bit longer than policymakers expect today. I mean, the quick fixes or paradigm changes in a complex reality and ever-evolving reality such as cyberspace requires at least that we learn some of the lessons that we've learned, that we've gained until now, and at the same time, it requires being forward-looking to a large extent, meaning understanding how regulatory techniques, how policy measures can actually try to capture specific dynamics in an environment that changes constantly, and where technology has proven to be relatively plastic, meaning that in the past, attempts to constrain technology, to give direction to digital technologies have seen normally a reaction which is adjusted, meaning to some of these changes, sometimes has even created a number of unintended effects. So I'm not going to dive very much into the current situation with GDPR. I will make some references to it. Recently was involved in a couple of discussions with the European Parliament on whether there should be a review of GDPR and what is the current state of things. But certainly this is a good starting point also to understand what might happen later. We have a number of policy measures that are on the table. The details are not fully known, although there are leaks, there are texts, there have been political agreements on some of them. But certainly what we're witnessing is an enormous proliferation, as you were saying, Oles, of proposals. Some of them might well overlap. They might a bit step on each other's toes to some extent. And they all, just to anticipate one of the things that I will say in the end, each of them comes with, if you wish, an independent monitoring and oversight mechanism, which at some point will have to be reconciled into a common system that does not monitor conduct and market developments in silos, but rather creates a more homogeneous, a more effective and pervasive way of enforcing legal rules. So I will go into a presentation which starts from, if you wish, more theoretical reflections, and then dives into what I think is this emerging technology stack, a new emerging digital ecosystem, and what is the role of the different provisions of data in this emerging ecosystem, to see whether our participants, first of all, agree with what my vision is, and second, whether they are positive about it, enthusiastic about it, or whether they fear that this really requires a fundamental change in the way in which we think about the digital economy going forward. So let me share my screen and go into the presentation on what I call the making of the European data ecosystem, right? Because indeed it's about creating from scratch something that does not exist, or fundamentally changing something that has not existed until now. So what is even Commissioner Breton has defined as the European way to data, right? And this for me, to understand whether this can work and how this will work and why we are changing the approach right now, I think it's good to go back. There are many academics connected, I understand, so it's good to go back to the way in which, particularly in economics, but more generally in social science, we conceptualize data and information. I mean, a typical thing that is said even today by many economists, and that has been increasingly resisted over time, is the fact that data is a public good. Meaning, originally in in economic theory, many economists have called data as a public good, meaning having features of non-rivalry, meaning that the consumption of data by one individual or one entity does not preclude consumption by others. And non-excludable, meaning that once data is out there, it's very easy to appropriate, and it's very difficult to exclude others from the consumption of the good. Now, those of you that work in the digital environment know that in many cases, data aggregation, data storage, data use has been largely privatized over these years. And so there are other parts, in particular in legal theory, there has been a big debate as to whether property rights over data could be conceptualized, whether the right to exclude others could be usefully implemented in practice, whether technological measures could be implemented to ensure that data becomes a more private good, subject to more control as regards the diffusion of data. The discussion of whether there is, data and information are somewhere in between, meaning something that is non-rival but can be excludable, as in the case of club goods or other things that have been used in if you wish, the law and economics literature and information, something like a semi-commons or a common pool resource that is in any case, like in the case of the commons, subject to congestion, overuse, and then ultimately a depletion of its value. So to me, understanding what has happened in the early days of the internet with respect to and with reference and comparison to what we are trying to do now really is something that requires a little bit of an understanding of this, as I will mention in the coming minutes. Academics have been working on this also to try and shed more light in this respect. So for me, just to oversimplify, because that's going to be a relatively short presentation, economists and social scientists have discovered over time that data is a very all-encompassing term where that comprises types of data that have a utility function, if you wish, that shows the maximum utility where data is kept closed. So there are data that actually deploy fully its value to their users, but in general also for society if they are kept private in the medium to long term. There are types of data that require pooling and sharing, but in a constrained environment, which means that if you want to build an optimal data strategy, you might want to keep the former types of data under the strict control of the individuals that own them, and if anything, giving them the possibility to share whatever they want, and other data where you need to encourage pooling in the first place, and but not open free flow of data, which has been otherwise the key principle and way in which we've been using data on the internet until legislation has tried to introduce some enhanced rights over and control rights over data. And there are types of data which are even creating the maximum value for society when they're openly shared. And so they're left to anyone who wants to use them without asking for consent to use them, aggregate them, process them, and perhaps generate services or research findings that are useful for society. Now, the complexity in looking at data in this way has created a big problem for policymaking going forward. But my attempt and my ambition in this presentation is to show you that the European Commission and EU institutions in general are trying to sort of create an optimal data strategy by providing incentives for the optimal sharing degree of data in the different cases in which sharing might potentially take place, or keeping the data private might potentially be an option. So one example is that the work that Diane Coyle and co-authors did in 2019. This has also permeated important turning moments in particular in the UK context with the Furman Review, where Diane Cole was one of the co-authors. And the idea is that depending on the type of data, you have different areas that you might want to build, different strategies that you want to build policy making that try to get to the different, to the optimal level of sharing. How do you govern the flow of data? Here I go a little bit back to the law and economics literature, and in particular, if you think about the literature since 1972, you know, Calabresi and Melamed, on how do you protect entitlements in society more generally. In some cases, you have property rules where the ones that hold the entitlement, I don't use the term property right because on data, this is very much debated, but those that have an entitlement over the usage of specific data, it could be personal data or industrial data, has the possibility of excluding others and to veto any possible use by others. Liability rules is the cases in which third parties can have access to data owned or held by others without asking for permission, but providing in some cases a remuneration, which, as you will see in the forthcoming Data Act, will be regulated down at the price level, at the cost level, sorry. Or in some cases, it might even take the form of a zero cost liability rule, where, for example, governments can get a hold of data that are in the possession of the private sector for cases of public emergency or cases in which this is evidently in the public interest. And we see exactly how this, let's say, potential conditions will be framed in the final Data Act. And then you have cases of inalienability, where you actually block the potential transfer of data in all cases, and you don't even give the enhanced possibility to those that hold the entitlement over data to share them, which is something that, as you will see, will be much less common in the forthcoming data strategy. There are cases in which they need to achieve enhanced cooperation and coordination over the joint managing of a data pool requires that players that hold their own property rules contract themselves into forms of association and organization, which could be like data spaces, which authors like Robert Merges in the past, I think it was 2005, defined as contracting into liability rules, which is something that happens already since many years in the world of patents, for example, with patent pools, where people that have exclusive rights, such as patents, pool their patents together for common licensing at fair and non-discriminatory conditions. Something that is perhaps one of the only references that we have on what could be the potential governance forms of forthcoming data intermediaries or data spaces. But you also have a number of problems in how to organize transactions over data whenever property rules in particular are assigned, and then policymakers want to unleash a market where entitlements over data are negotiated. And in this typically is represented in economic theory by the information paradox of Kenneth Arrow, which looks at information as a very peculiar, say, item for negotiation. Why? Because sharing information doesn't mean that you lose possession of the information, which means, and also in order to show the value of information to those that will want to use them, you already to some extent have to share this information. And this creates transaction costs, hesitancy in engaging in data sharing for fear of losing control over the diffusion of information, but also of creating competitors. And perhaps even losing the possibility of capturing the value of this data. Academics that have been working on this much more complex and fragmented view of information and data, such as Jeff Mulgan, for example, with co-authors over the years, have worked on a representation of how data changes and data, let's say, sharing and data markets, if you pass me the term, change depending on how much control do individuals have over data. Complete control versus compulsory sharing, you see this on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, how much value does the public currently get out of the shared data. which might change again depending on the utility function of that specific data part. And you see, without going into the details here, but there are potentially for each of those boxes that you see there, a different approach in the data strategy that would aim at achieving the right amount of sharing, the optimal amount of sharing, and the optimal amount of control. So my open question there would be, can the European Commission achieve something like this through a series of regulatory measures, or is the market a better mechanism to sort out what is the optimal level of sharing and the optimal level of control? This is a series of considerations that do not apply to the original internet. I mean, this is a representation of, let's say, the World Wide Web as computer scientists and network engineers who used to represent it in the early 90s, what we call sometimes the OC layered representation, where you have a physical infrastructure, you have logical layers, traffic rules made of open standards. You have a world on top of this, which is largely the world that is defined as the world of permissionless innovation, which means the possibility of using all the data that are out there, the possibility of developing applications and using open standards to have data flow as freely as possible, under the overall belief that the world would be best served by the free flow of data. So the more data flow freely, the more you realize this thing that I don't dig into too deeply at for this presentation, but I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, which is the network externalities, the fact that the more information flows among peers in an end-to-end architecture like the internet, the more the value of that network will be generated, will be maximized, right? After the first 3 decades, and sorry for cutting corners a little bit there, but just to give a framework to this presentation, after 3 decades of World Wide Web since the early 90s, what we've discovered is that this has generated an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of user-generated, not largely individually generated information that were spontaneously put on the internet, typically an extraordinary lack of control for the diffusion of information, attempts, of course, to protect largely through technical means the diffusion of information, but largely an unregulated space in which information could flow under the promise that this would be realizing, let's say, a promise of a very democratic and pluralistic environment. So as all of you know, what we have witnessed is something a little bit different. And I like to analyze the evolution of cyberspace a little bit like biologists analyze the evolution of biological entities, if you wish, evolutionary biology. So what this has created over time is an overabundance of information. And rather than realizing necessarily the promise of creating opportunities for everybody, this has generated at once, due to the lack of control over the diffusion, hesitancy in sharing for those that could potentially share information, but also largely as an echoing the work, for example, of Herbert Simon, or already, let's say, 7 decades ago, a situation in which this wealth of information has generated a poverty of attention and has generated opportunities to pool information, aggregate information in the hands of only a few players. So in this unregulated space, just like in the law of the jungle, it's not necessarily, let's say, the results that you get in observing the evolution of inter-individual dynamics is not necessarily an ecumenical result where everybody gets a fair share, right? So the first thing that we've seen is the emergence of large places of aggregation of data, and those places that had made the most, and those legal systems that have encouraged in the best possible way the free flow of data, have taken an edge there with aggregations of data under large data storage centers in the cloud in the hands of a very few companies. This obviously has been a wake-up call, perhaps a late wake-up call for European policymakers, once they realize in particular that, quoting what the European Commission said already in a recent communication, Today, over 90% of the data generated on the internet are in the hands of a fistful of companies based in the United States. And the remaining 10% is not necessarily in the hands of European companies. Actually, there are cloud giants such as Alibaba that also gather and aggregate quite a lot of data. So there are several things that have happened, and I could go on, obviously, with the problems and if you wish, the lack of economic sustainability and fair allocation of value that we've seen on the internet. But there are several problems that have emerged over time that I try to summarize very quickly and visually here, without the ambition to dig deeply into all of them. The first of all is indeed what I mentioned already: the concentration of data in a few hands and the concentration of market power. In some cases, even despite or some scholars say facilitated by some later regulatory interventions that have tried to invert the trend by introducing more restrictive measures on the flow of data, including GDPR. We see today that many of the tech giants have actually consolidated their market position as an unintended effect of GDPR, because they can deny, for example, data transfers to new entrants by invoking the presence of personally identifiable data in the swaths of data that they possess. We've seen an imperfect protection of users' personal data today, and I'll go very quickly through this, but we have a situation in which the enforcement of GDPR and specific mechanisms such as the one-stop shops, but also many other elements that we see in GDPR today have generated a number of unintended and undesirable effects. The protection of personal data today and the level of compliance with GDPR is very difficult to estimate. It is certainly not 100%. But we've seen a number of situations in which the plasticity of technology, the ability to algorithmically sidestep some of the provisions, has given in particular to tech giants the possibility to continue massively processing user data, and despite the fact that in principle GDPR was supposed to introduce a data minimization principle. There is also an ongoing process of let's say vertical integration of multi-service companies that offer services and offer products that generate data and retain the entitlements over those data. This is a typical case of user access to, well, the lack of user access to data generated by wearables or other IoT devices. This also at the industrial level, where the data generated are typically in the hands of the platforms that provide those devices in the first place. To give you one perhaps distant example that I've witnessed by researching agriculture in the United States. Today, farmers in the United States have to approach large tech giants or large companies that have been enormously digitized, such as Monsanto or John Deere, to ask for the permission or ask for access to the data generated by their own land through the use of sensors and other IoT devices. So the control and the bargaining edge in this case, and even the possibility to exclude the original users, is in the hands of the vendors. Vendors typically might keep many of these players in a situation of lock-in. You will see that the Data Act tries to remedy this specific situation. Lack of certainty, lack of control over the diffusion also generated over time high transaction costs in business-to-business data sharing. So as you start seeing, there are cases in which perhaps data flows are excessive, and in other cases in which data flows are insufficient. There is uncertainty surrounding the possibility for specific players or individuals that want to sort of donate their data or provide data for the public interest, for example, in what is sometimes called data altruism. The conditions that apply to this are very uncertain and very fragmented throughout the single market. And this is one of the, nobody knows exactly how big this market is supposed to be, but it's one of the elements that were identified by policymakers. There is, as a corollary of what I said at the beginning, the concentration of market power, and also the vendor lock-in, a gradual process of value capture from the whole ecosystem into this big fat middle that is the cloud-based giants. And this happens in business-to-business context, and even more in platform-to-business context, because it's typically the platforms that retain value. But I say B2B also because it happens increasingly also along industrial value chains, where the fair allocation of value in industrial value chains is not guaranteed, and there's always situations of economic dependency that we have seen in many industrial contexts that are replicated also in terms of the allocation of value. So this is, if you wish, an element of economic unsustainability that leads to a situation where a lot of the real economy, but a lot of the players on industrial value chains see their know-how, their industrial data, their ability to make the most of the value that they generate gradually diminished and reduced, with an overall result that in the medium to long term could be an agonizing, know-how and knowledge in those portions of the value chain. Insufficient data sharing for good is not just a matter of altruism, but it's also something that we've seen clearly during the pandemic, when there is a need to leverage data for good and in the public interest. Governments have found themselves in some cases facing a wall, or the need to negotiate on a commercial basis access to data, which is something that a Data Act, which is again forthcoming, will most likely try to remedy by imposing what I called zero-based, zero cost or zero price liability rules, or anyway, regulated, well, sharing it, mandatory sharing, compulsory access at regulated prices. And then finally, among the various problems, as I mentioned already, the lack of digital sovereignty, the lack of, generation of a big pool of data and value in support of the evolution of the data ecosystem at the EU level, with a lot of capture of value that ends up in the hands of non-European companies, which, as you know, has been one of the key concerns, particularly for Commissioner Breton, but more generally for the European Commission, since in particular the von der Leyen Commission took office. And then more generally, a consideration of the fact that Europe has definitely missed and the first wave of data generation, the data generated by the users. But we are now facing an explosion of data produced not only by individuals, but most importantly by things. In a recent research that I did for the European Parliament, I interviewed a number of industry players to get a sense of what could be a reasonable projection for the number of connected objects at the global level in 2035. Knowing that today we estimate having between 6 and 8 billion connected devices at the global level, in 2035, the estimate that I got is 1 trillion connected devices. And you can only imagine this big wave of data production between machines and the needs to ensure that data flows are governed in a way that maintains and preserves the control over, in particular, industrial data by the companies that produce them. This generates enormous challenges, in particular for Europe as an industrial superpower, and some member states therein in particular, such that as an existential strategy for Europe, it is absolutely imperative not to miss the second data revolution, and to put in place those conditions that would enable a fair allocation of value and potentially the creation of a unique European space for data going forward. So what is the first thing I want to do is show you very quickly how this little layered environment that I showed you at the beginning is likely to change as a result of the creation of all these proposals that have been piled up by the European Commission over the past 2 years, basically, as the von der Leyen Commission is now over the 2 years of existence. So certainly we'll see a proliferation in modes of connectivity, which also come with different modes of sharing data. The idea to somehow contrast the current polarization and concentration of market power in the hands of a fistful of players by creating a federated cloud environment with standards that govern interoperability, access to data by competitors whenever possible, in some cases forcing sharing of data, and obviously enabling the pooling of data in what we call data spaces. At the bottom, something that did not necessarily exist, at least to the same extent before, and it has emerged over time, which is this enormous additional infrastructure which generates data, which is the Internet of Things, which requires in some cases decentralized architectures and also decentralized forms of artificial intelligence, and what we call the edge layer as an intermediate layer between the things and the cloud for data processing, storage, and AI, embedded in particular AI uses or small data AI in industrial contexts. And then on top of this, in order to enable more control over the flows of data, the European Commission has started, and the EU institutions more generally have started working on a number of layers of control which didn't exist before, meaning they are emerging over time, which impose more layers of identification, authentication, verification, and layers and standardized interoperability in legal terms and in semantic terms. Now, this is a much fatter infrastructure, if you wish, an ecosystem than the one that we've been used to before. And on top of this, the European Commission builds its data strategy made of a number of cross-cutting data spaces, where mostly the mode of data aggregation will be by opening up data in the hands of public governments, making them interoperable, but at the same time, forcing or encouraging transfer of data into common pools for very horizontal and very far-reaching uses in the public interest. The skills data set, the data space for the Green Deal, which is something that is now being even discussed at the international level, including, for example, in the Trade and Technology Council with the United States, the idea of potentially launching joint data spaces where the data is then put to use through enhanced applications in machine learning and AI to try to tackle some of the key problems in climate change in particular, and the common data space for the administrations, which is very much related to also the interoperability strategy at the EU level. Now, on top of this, my view of the emerging technology stack at the EU level envisages at least 4 different provinces of the internet, which are associated with different modes of data provision, sharing, and governance. One, you see this at the top left, which is the sectoral data spaces, which will require and originally are motivated by the fact that in order to avoid the data capture, meaning the transfer of value from real economy players or from, say, a sector-specific players to the large tech platforms, there could be the possibility of pooling data to optimize service and to jointly manage this data, also when negotiating with larger and more powerful players. The example of the agriculture is typical, but the typical European example is automotive, where you might want to pool the data to optimize traffic, to optimize third-party services, but also to increase the bargaining power of the players in the automotive space, such as the car manufacturers, vis-a-vis the large tech giants that otherwise would, through the process of value extraction and data extraction, capture most of the value from value-added services in those spaces, thereby somehow emptying out the competitiveness of those industrial ecosystems for Europe. The second is the one that we knew since the very beginning, an open internet environment where data flow relatively freely, subject obviously to provisions of data protection. And what we have seen already in the past 3 decades, so the emergence of digital platforms where data in a B2C setting will be regulated in a slightly different way, but largely it's a bilateral relationship between consumers and businesses, or even more platforms, and a space for digital government where there's the additional challenge of having digital governments acquire data, whether commercially or in a regulatory way from the private sector, but also opening up not only high value data sets, as in the Open Data Directive, but also all other data sets that can be reused by researchers and businesses under specific conditions, right? In particular, the protection of confidentiality, the non-exclusivity, and going forward. And on top of this, obviously, there are the end users. And there are a number of, if you wish, horizontal development that are not layers of this technology stack, but are very important because they apply to most of these layers. One is obviously the application of AI and the consequent regulation as well, regulatory measures that are being proposed through most of these layers. Something that, in my opinion, is still largely missing in the puzzle, which is the definition and the development of new protocols and standards to enhance the control of end users over their data and their diffusion, and the managing of consent on the reuse and reselling of this data in a dynamic way. And there's also, related to many of these layers, provisions on cybersecurity, right? I'll just change the background to enable a better view, but just to give you an idea of how complicated is this exercise, and perhaps Oles will tell me that I'm increasing complexity rather than reducing it, is that we see on the side of personal data control, the GDPR, obviously, but potentially embedding of technological protection measures in the forthcoming revision of GDPR in the next couple of years. The Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, mostly looking at ways to regulate the behavior of digital platforms, or in particular, large-scale digital platforms, and even transitioning from exposed competition rules into ex-ante regulatory measures for those platforms that are of sufficient size to be defined as gatekeepers. We have the Data Governance Act and Data Act, which looks at the functioning and the internal dynamics of the sectoral data spaces, which is not the only thing that they do, obviously. They also, together with the industrial strategy and the Green Deal to some extent, will govern the governance of cross-cutting data spaces as well. The AI Act and the forthcoming provisions on liability, most of these are proposals, right? Still at the proposal stage, will govern the way in which artificial intelligence is applied, including when it's applied to the gathering and the processing of data in data spaces, and the interoperability strategy, the e-identity, the single digital gateway, all this apply to this new layer of legal and semantic interoperability and digital verification and authentication. The Gaia-X project tries to incorporate many of these regulatory provisions and this environment into a series of technical specification and protocols, including imposing to those that access the cloud space compliance with GDPR and other provisions, and perhaps data interoperability provisions by design in what sometimes is called law as code, if you wish. So rather than relying on legal provisions, relying not on legal codes, but on software codes in order to achieve these results. And then we have emerging provisions that will interact with the Data Governance Act and the Data Act in particular on the edge infrastructure and the Internet of Things, more on the industrial policy side, but also forthcoming legal measures in the CHIPS Act. The connectivity layer, obviously, is also traditionally regulated. The digital principles apply, as you see on top, to the condition and the rights that end users might claim, and it overlaps with the rights that end users will have, in particular under the Data Act, because right to interoperability, but also the rights to the protection of intellectual property are featured in the digital principles, and obviously network and information security directive and on the part of cybersecurity. Now, I think I'm done with this. Yeah, so I probably have not considered each and every regulatory measure, but you can only imagine the level of complexity that this is bringing into the European acquis for the digital ecosystem, and especially if you consider the fact that basically each of these provisions comes with a different monitoring and oversight and enforcement mechanism, which are at the moment uncoordinated. meaning an AI board, a data innovation board, in the Data Act, competent authorities at the national level. In the DSA and the DMA, there are for each of them individual bodies or networks of national regulators that are being set up, and obviously the DPAs under the GDPR and so on and so forth. The level of complexity is understandable in terms of the drafting of legislation, the different legal provisions. At the moment, this looks very much like a puzzle without a lot of glue, and it is very much fragmented when it comes to the enforcement. Now, embracing this complexity from a data strategy viewpoint means pulling and pushing, so sort of encouraging more data sharing in some cases, less in others, more pooling or less pooling in others, and at the same time promoting competition. So whenever you encourage the pooling of data, you also have to enable the possibility for new entrants to have access to similar levels of aggregation of data. Whenever you encourage a sharing of, for example, public data, you have to make sure that sharing does not lead to appropriation by individual entities. So what we see at the moment, if we had to sort of group together some, at least, of the policy goals that are pursued by the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, the minimization of the flow of personally identifiable data, so enhancing control, but also industrial data, I would say, enhancing the control of individuals and in particular small businesses on the diffusion of their data when they think about sharing them. So encouraging businesses to share data, including through altruism, but also through B2B contractor relations that will be regulated in the Data Act, enabling managed data sharing within those pools, those data spaces, the governance of which is not defined in any deep way in the Data Governance Act or in the Data Act. Facilitated switching between cloud and edge services, so avoiding, again, vendor lock-in by hopefully creating the preconditions for suitable alternatives. And this is, again, something that we might want to discuss in the Q&A, whether this is likely to occur under the current provisions. Obliging, in some cases, businesses and platforms to share data for good and in cases of public emergency. Avoiding data hoarding, accumulation, and value capture, including through, for example, the fairness testing of contractual arrangements between businesses or between platforms and businesses. Ensuring fair contractual conditions, again, in data sharing contracts. And ultimately, as a sort of overarching goal, increasing Europe's data sovereignty, which is something that might or might not happen based on the provisions that we see. It might happen as a result of a combination of these emerging proposals and industrial projects such as Gaia X and the future European Cloud Federation. So if you take the original scheme that was already relatively complicated, this comes from the Finnish Innovation Foundation, Sitra, that looks at the potential different interactions between players, persons, businesses, and governments in the data ecosystem. First of all, we are seeing an attempt. I've added in the middle platforms because they create, I think, platforms are very salient in the data strategy, meaning that there is a concrete attempt, and I mean by platforms the existing tech platforms and the tech giants. There is an attempt to reduce the flow of data, which is currently, as I was saying, only partly under the control of the persons in this scheme, or the users and the individuals, vis-a-vis government, vis-a-vis businesses, and vis-a-vis platforms. There are provisions, and you see the green arrows that I've created here are more the encouraging, whereas the red are the limitation or the enhanced control. There are provisions that are aimed at encouraging the flow from businesses to government and from businesses to other businesses and to individuals. There are provisions that mandate flow of information from individuals, from businesses, and from platforms to governments. But there are also provisions that you can see on the business side to encourage the pooling of data inside the B2B realm, and provisions for sharing of data across administrations between governments at specific conditions. So I'll get back to this graph in a second, but just to quickly go through some of the key provisions of these proposals. I don't want to dwell too much on them because they have not become legislation yet, and the text can still change, although the DGA has been subject only a few weeks ago to political agreement. The DGA tries to solve some of these bits of the puzzle by encouraging the creation of data intermediaries that would somehow be separated entities or functionally separated entities that would then have as an incentive the pooling of data, encouraging data sharing at transparent conditions. They would need to notify their existence to competent national authorities. They will be inspected and subject to monitoring for their compliance with several obligations, such as fairness in the treatment of the data, the impartiality, secure storage and handling, compliance with competition rules, and so on and so forth. Indeed, the creation of a data intermediary looks a little bit like a risky business because, first of all, the incentive to reuse data that you have accumulated as a data intermediary will not be there. There's no possibility to reuse the data that are aggregated, and it will be interesting to see what this means in practice. There is a need to ensure structural separation of the data sharing activity from whatever other activity, so sort of an unbundling of this specific activity from any other that the intermediary might be performing. And there is potential of sanctions, of inspections that all are a little bit up in the air because they depend very much on how enforcement will actually play out in the future. And there's another big chapter on provisions for government sharing and ensuring the safe reuse of data that are in the hands of the public sector, but are subject to third-party rights. So these are not the open data that are subject to the Open Data Directive, but these are data that typically have to be cleared for confidentiality and both for the individual level, but also for the industrial level, but they could be offered for enhanced innovation and research to third parties. There are specific conditions that are listed in the Data Governance Act, including in particular non-exclusivity whenever governments share data or make data sets available to a third party. But also there are governance provisions such as the creation of single contact points at the national level, a single register of public sector data at the European level, and the creation of an expert group, which will be named the Data Innovation Board, that is supposed to monitor and give advice on how this reusing and sharing of public sector data is actually taking place, and whether the conditions that apply are sufficient safeguards for the safe transfer of these data. And there are also provisions to encourage data altruism, including the possibility for intermediaries to register as provider of services, of data altruism services. Now, compared to this, perhaps more important is what is about to happen in the forthcoming Data Act, which does many things. I only have selected a couple, but there are more, so we can discuss them towards the end. The addressing of imbalances in business-to-business contractual, business-to-business contractual power by standardizing templates, by providing fairness testing for contractual provisions, by ensuring portability rights and avoiding vendor lock-in, by protecting industrial data and trade secrets in various ways, and also governing business-to-government data sharing for the public interest. But it's not clear under what conditions this will be voluntary and when it will be binding. What is defined as a public interest? What would be the remuneration? Sometimes zero, sometimes low. This is my take. How are data and relaxed costs compensated? So going back, and as I'm about to wrap up, going back to this graph that I sent you before, you see that there is a number of new features that will emerge to enable a more controlled governance of the EU data space. PIMS, our personal information management system, such as data pods or things like my data protocols and so on and so forth. The rest should be relatively clear, but I'm happy to clarify. And you have that some of these elements are largely under the remit of the Data Governance Act. Other elements will be covered by the Data Act, but also the Digital Services Act, the Platform to Business Regulation, the Digital Markets Act, European interoperability framework. So there will be a lot of overlaps between these different pieces of legislation. As a quick mention, a lot of this requires standards to work. And if you see, only 3 days ago, I think the European Commission has published a new work program for standardization for 2022. And you see at least 2 elements there that are important. The launching of activities on standardizing smart contracts for data spaces, developing standards on essential requirements for smart contracts as set out in the Data Act, and also requirements on the safe and trustworthy artificial intelligence systems that will apply to many data processing activities in general. So where this is leading, nobody knows. Some doubts. Are we micromanaging the data ecosystem? So can we, by developing a legal rule for every single case of data sharing, will we get a hold of this ever-changing complexity? What are the potentially sort of secondary effects, or what will be the reaction of cyberspace to this? Is also interesting to see. Are we sure that we can do this with traditional rulemaking or even standards, or we need to do this technologically? And so develop standards that are go in the direction of code as law. What are as I said already, what are the monitoring and enforcement provisions? How do we get rid of the overlaps and develop a consistent ecosystem, including in particular an ecosystem of oversight? And with something I haven't even touched upon, but what would be the relation of these rules with pre-existing sectoral rules that already work on things like open API and ensure access to competitors to existing data, such as the PSD2, the Second Payment Services Directive in the financial sector. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It was really fascinating, both the situation and your in the market and your presentation. I'll open the floor for Q&A in a minute. Just wanted to ask one clarificatory question, perhaps. So it's probably a stereotypic question. We understand intuitively how you can profit from generating big data in one, in one place. We also understand how you can operationalize the model when you have a government who has an access to all the data and who can pretty much arbitrarily channel the processing of data and its further evolution and exploitation. If you look at this model, which appears to be very sophisticated and really advanced, I was wondering, my intuitive question: is it designed to as inevitable proposal, regulatory proposal to capture the new emergent reality in data management in the broader sense of the term? Is it inevitable to be so complex, and how it how it would promote these ideas of European sovereignty if it will be open for all intermediaries, supposedly, or it will be some barriers which would somehow design the addressees or beneficiaries of the model?
It's an interesting question. First of all, I agree with you. It's much more intuitive to think about data aggregation as a way to generate value, because data has properties that recall economies of scale, meaning the more you have, the more you detect patterns, the more you can process data, the more you can engage in predictive analytics, the more you can do many things. We're not necessarily capturing a very consolidated trend in the market. I think this is more of a push in this case from the EU institutions to try and create models where models have only timidly emerged in this market. So it is an attempt to turn the tide, which is different from what has happened in other fields, right? Where you regulate to reflect something that has already happened in reality, or in the subject matter and in the context that you want to regulate. You reflect the fact that things have already changed or are already changing. In this case, I think there is a lot of proactive regulatory interventions, which borders, actually, it is a clear attempt to engage in industrial policy via regulatory means. Some of the original provisions were much more oriented towards digital sovereignty. For example, the fact that data intermediaries would need to be based in the European Union, or perhaps a little bit more aggressive provisions for governments to attract data from and keep them and reuse them as European data. But most of these provisions have been watered down in the text of the Data Governance Act. I received a leak of the Data Act. As far as I see, also those provisions have been eliminated. So I'm not sure that this is going to lead to, and this complexity was needed. I mean, time will tell, but in my opinion, there are 2 or 3 key provisions, such as the imposition of interoperability obligations. So for cases of large data aggregation that would by themselves perhaps have generated enough momentum for increased data sharing. I think this could have been easily implemented, for example, in the Digital Markets Act. But I don't want to destroy the castle, but I'm afraid that in some cases we will be looking at an excess level of fragmentation and complexity, which I don't know who, perhaps an AI system will be able to govern all these different regulatory interventions all at once.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Let me open the floor for questions. People decide. Can I just very briefly ask, do you see some comparable initiatives in other jurisdictions, or the EU is by far taking the lead in the global regulatory race?
I can say something perhaps a little bit provocative. I see this environment as being quite similar, although with the due differences, to what China is doing. China is creating an ecosystem of data where there are provisions similar to GDPR on the side of protecting personally identifiable data. There are provisions on the data sharing between businesses, but obviously there's a huge set of provisions on sharing data with the government, which perhaps in terms of specific weight are greater and than what happens than what is likely to happen in the EU going forward. But I think one could say that the situation in China is much more similar to the situation in the EU. Compared to the situation in the US at the moment, where a lot of this is left to market forces for the time being.
Wouldn't it be the case that undertakings who can benefit from synthesizing their own individual data with the newly emerging regulatory, very advanced, very sophisticated, and probably definitely forward-looking mechanism, they would have a competitive advantage by having an access to both worlds, whereas the European undertakings will be confined exclusively to the model which is supposed to be, fair, and which is inherently fair if you take it as the only available mechanism.
Well, one of the key issues here is whether the EU will be still able to leverage the sheer size of its single market by imposing compliance with these rules also to non-European players, which is a little bit or part of what is sometimes called the Brussels effect, right? But indeed, but I remember the Commissioner Breton saying that his main concern was that the value and the share of that Europe has in the data economy can be estimated at 3-4% at the moment, whereas the share of Europe on the global economy, on GDP, let's say, is like 16-17%. So he said the two things would need to be much more similar, right? But for me, there's a danger. I mean, you can converge downwards. If you close yourself and you overregulate yourself, you might end up having the weight of the EU on the global economy go down to 4% rather than bringing the role of the EU and the share of the data economy of the EU go up to 16%. So that is something that one needs to take into account. And I'm not, as many of you probably know, I am not an anti-regulatory person. I normally am a believer in the need for regulation in cyberspace. But this puzzles me more than, for example, the AI Act or the Digital Markets Act. These interventions are potentially very complex, and we've seen already many member states of the EU being skeptical. There's the one that has been more outspoken is the Netherlands, that has published a non-paper on the Data Act, advocating a little bit more simplification and perhaps reliance on, in some cases, on market forces under constant monitoring, obviously. So I see that the trajectory of the Data Act is far from established at the moment, meaning that it could be many provisions on which there is a bouncing back from industry, but also from member states.
And if you monitor closely the relationship, for example, the development of the Digital Markets Act, we definitely see how different lobbying strategies have been implemented over the last year, or the last 2 years, when the consultation was new competition tool was on the table. And you somehow can infer that this act has the power behind it, potential power. Do you observe such lobbying, trying to slow down the process or redirect it towards, different avenues in this part of the digital economy, digital society?
I see quite, the thing here is that the level of complexity is higher. It's difficult to conceptualize. It's really difficult to conceptualize the Data Governance Act and the Data Act. And that's why I chose today to sort of put it in a broader frame, right? The public consultation has retrieved less responses and less vibrant responses compared to others. It is not clear exactly how all these different pieces will be held together. I see potentially emerging tensions and pressure to slow down a little bit this process, although they are less polarized, as in the case of the Digital Markets Act, right? Here, it's much more difficult to have a simple position on the Data Act, for example. You probably need to write, I don't know, a PhD thesis on each and every provision, because, for example, I haven't mentioned that, but there is a provision in the current text of the Data Act that forces manufacturers of devices to incorporate in their design the unbundling of the data, and so the possibility for the users of those devices to gain access to the data and share with third parties without asking for the consent of the original vendor. And there's no way of sidestepping this provision by designing integrated devices. So there has to be a clear design principle for which data produced by the device can be unbundled and subject to services provided by other parties, right? And the other thing is fairness provisions in business-to-business contracts being an almost regulatory measure with cost plus, just like in network industries. And an attempt to make some sense of something that for academics has been a very tough nut to crack for years. For example, the idea of friend or fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory conditions within data sharing, which are evoked, but we know already how difficult that is going to be in practice, because it's always been, you ask 50 academics about what is friend, and they give you 50 different answers, right?
This was really fascinating. Thank you very much, Andrea, for this really illuminating, detailed, nuanced, but also somehow visionary view about this really important topic. We really appreciate your time and the sharing your expertise, your wisdom with us. Thank you very much indeed.
So I hope the participants have not fainted in the meanwhile, or they have not been discouraged by this, but I encourage them to reach out individually if they have doubts. This is an area where there is a need for everybody's expertise, and I've offered my view, hopefully contributing to a little bit of stage setting. But I think I myself want to go much deeper once these texts will become available, right? And try to make sure that we can gradually digest this new plethora of regulatory and policy provisions.